Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Ballmeyer, and I am the local history librarian here at Johnson County Library. Thank you for attending today's program, The Past is Prologue, the Orphan Train Movement. The Past is Prologue is a bi-monthly program offered by Johnson County Library where we highlight topics that are often left out, glossed over, or misrepresented in our history books. We would also like to begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. Our Kansas City institutions stand on the ancestral and treated lands of Native American peoples at the juncture of the Missouri and Kansas rivers. In recent years, these nations have included the Delaware, Kansas, Missouri, Oto, Osage, and Shawnee. We pay respects to all Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for their continuing presence in this land and the land where you may be joining us from tonight. Now, please join me in welcoming Kaily Carson.
Thank you, Amanda, for welcoming me and inviting me to give this great presentation. I'm excited to be here with you all tonight. So, between the years of 1850 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were taken from East Coast orphanages and other institutions and were placed in homes across the country. And we call this migration of children the Orphan Train Movement. So this presentation tonight will give you an understanding of why this movement happened, how the system developed, how it worked, and ultimately how it ended. So let's begin. Excuse me, you'll have to excuse my voice through this presentation. I'm just getting over a cold. But let's begin by understanding why there were so many children in need of homes. So New York City in the 1850s was nothing like the New York City you picture today. There were no skyscrapers, no subways, and less than 500,000 people lived there. But the city was changing very quickly. And this was in large part due to the large number of immigrants that were entering the city every day. And these immigrants came for a lot of different reasons. Some were fleeing religious persecution, famine, lack of jobs or other resources. Some were fleeing genocide, and others were just simply joining family members who had already moved to the United States. But in general, they were coming because they saw America as a land of opportunity. As you can see from this graph, during the years of the Orphan Train Movement, New York City's population grew from about 500,000 people to over 5 million people. And this population explosion, like I mentioned, was caused by a large number of immigrants, but also people who were leaving their farms in the United States and moving to the city where they could find more steady work. And New York City was unprepared for this massive amount of growth in such a short span of time. Jobs were plentiful, but they relied on the easy replacement of their workers, so safety was not a priority and pay was very low. Disease was rampant, housing and food were scarce and in high demand, and one solution to the housing problem was to create hastily and poorly constructed buildings called tenements. Tenements were often dark, dirty, crowded, probably very smelly, and disease-ridden. These two photos by Jacob Reese show their sorry state. The one on the left shows nearly the whole apartment and everything this couple owns. And the one on the right shows how way too many people could be crammed into one small living space. The people in this picture are paying 5 cents a night to have just a spot to sleep. And I like to have people see if you can count how many individuals are sleeping in this one room. I'll give you just a few seconds. Most of our school groups count at least 7 people in that room. So how did children fit into the mix here? By the 1850s, ideas about children and childhood were shifting. Children began to be seen as innocents who needed protection and good Christian training, instead of just being viewed as small adults. Ideally, children would be raised by their mother primarily and would have plenty of time to learn and play. But for families who were not middle or upper class, the reality of childhood was very different. Children often needed to work just to help cover the costs of rent and food and clothing. Some children would work in their tenement homes after school, like the children you see on the left. They are 12, 9, and 5, and they make flowers in their home. These children had both of their parents living, but based off of the photographer's reports, their father did not work much and did not really help to support the family. So it was left to these kids and their mother to make sure the rent got paid and everybody had enough food and clothes. Other children, like the one on the right, had to work outside of their homes doing things like shining shoes or selling newspapers. Sometimes these children were able to go to school during the day, but often all they had time to do was to work. Some of these children also lost their parents to dangerous factory jobs, disease, or war. Other children were abandoned by one or more parents, and some were removed from their homes because of abuse or neglect. Many of these children, though, had loving parents who just simply could not earn enough to care for their families. Some historians estimate that in 1850, when New York City's population was only about 500,000, there were anywhere between 10 and 30,000 homeless children living on the streets of New York. And that number does not consider the number of children already living in institutions. So what did welfare look like at this time? What were your options? Well, at the beginning of the 1800s, government-sponsored welfare did not really exist. There were some taxes that funded a few public institutions, but most welfare programs were run by religious institutions. The public aid that did exist was very hard to qualify for. By the 1820s, so many people were seeking out public aid that something needed to be done. This is when social reformers stepped in, wealthy philanthropists like the Astors, the Carnegies, and these families began building and donating to public and private almshouses, poorhouses, hospitals, orphanages, and other kinds of institutions. To put this in perspective, in 1825, the state of New York had built there were 4 orphan asylums operating in the state. And I don't believe very many of them, if any of them, were run by the state itself. By 1860, this number had grown from 4 to 60. And that does not address almshouses, adult asylums, and other institutions that would have housed children or could have housed children. And this expansion of public and private welfare through the 1800s was aided in part by religious revivals in the 1850s. And it was also, unfortunately, fueled by ideas of social Darwinism and fears that if nothing was done for the poor, they would eventually threaten society. These images you see on your screen now depict conditions at Blackwell's Island, which is now known as Roosevelt Island. Blackwell's Island had a few workhouses, an almshouse, a prison, general hospital, a smallpox hospital, what they called a lunatic asylum, a chapel, and a lighthouse. It was kind of like our Arkham Island in the Batman series. That's really an actually good comparison to make here. Another example of welfare institutions at this time include the Five Points Mission, which was located in the Five Points neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. And in the 1800s, this area was very densely populated with lots of crime and disease. And the Five Points Mission was opened in 1853 by the Methodist Church to provide housing, clothes, food, and education to the poor. And it was in these 2 places that a young minister named Charles Loring Brace began his work in social welfare. Brace was born in 1826, and he studied divinity and theology in college and became a minister in 1849. And then he took off for a good old tour of Europe. And while he was there, he observed the social programs in Europe. And a couple of these programs would eventually influence his starting of the Orphan Train Movement. And we'll come back to those in a couple slides. When he returned to New York, he started working in the Five Points Mission and Blackwell's Island. And as he worked there, he noticed that there were a lot of children seeking help in New York City's institutions. And like most of his contemporaries, he felt that these children should have the opportunity to experience childhood and be raised in a home where they could be loved and nurtured. He also knew that most of New York City's institutions could not provide that level of care. Brace felt that his Christian duty demanded that he help these children and teach them Christian values. He also had some economical motivations here, though. He viewed poverty as a cycle that continues from generation to generation, and he felt that helping these children would lighten the load on future public institutions, which were already underfunded. He also knew that there was a demand for labor in the West that could be abated by older children. So in 1853, Charles Loring Brace, along with a few other ministers and businessmen, founded the Children's Aid Society, which was one of many institutions directed towards helping New York City's children. The first things they did were open lodging houses and industrial schools for poor and orphaned children, so they would have places to stay, food to eat, and an opportunity to learn practical skills like sewing, cobbling, and other trades. They also founded farms outside of the city to give older children the opportunity to learn farm skills and get some fresh air. And many of these programs still exist in some form today, though they have changed quite a bit. Soon after their founding, the Children's Aid Society started their emigration department, which became to be known as their placing out department. And this is the department that pioneered what we now call the Orphan Train, though at the time it was referred to primarily as placing out. It's likely that the idea for this program was inspired by a couple different sources. First, the British transportation system, which basically was the British government sending their less desirable citizens to their colonies. So they sent them to Cape Town, Canada, and Australia. There were also some programs in Germany where they would send vagrant city children to rural homes, again, kind of a farming situation, farming communities. And then he was also inspired by existing placing out programs already operating in New England. And most of these were very small scale, so it was basically local foster care. And Brace observed these three different systems, adapted the ideas, and formed his own system. So the idea behind placing out was, again, that poor and orphan children needed and deserved a family home where they could have stability, clean air, good examples, and an opportunity to learn hard work and become upstanding citizens. And Brace felt that the West was the place for this to happen. Throughout the 19th century, railroads were rapidly expanding. Many of the rail lines offered discounted tickets to people moving west to settle, and that included children. This made railroads the most inexpensive and most effective way to move children westward. The Children's Aid Society sent their first orphan train to Dowagiac, Michigan in 1854, and all 46 children on that first train found homes in that area. The Children's Aid Society soon began sending children to other states, following the expansion of their railroad to new towns willing to take groups of children. By 1890, which was the middle of the Orphan Train movement and kind of the peak Orphan Train, more than 150,000 miles of railroad tracks existed. And this enabled the Children's Aid Society and many other organizations to send children almost anywhere in the Midwest. Before the children even left New York, though, an agent would already have arranged their route, their destination, and they also organized a group of people and their destination to start approving families who wanted to foster these kids. This committee was usually made up of doctors, clergymen, bankers, teachers, and other upstanding and influential men. As local community members, these men knew their neighbors better than the agents from New York did, and they could recommend or discourage children being placed with families who they knew would provide good or bad homes. Children were taken west in groups anywhere from about 5 to as many as 40, at least through the Children's Aid Society, sometimes 50. And they were always under the supervision of at least one agent. Contrary to popular belief, most orphan trains only made 1 or maybe 2 stops. When they arrived at their destination, their agent would prepare the children to be selected by a new family. They were usually taken to a hotel, bathed, and given a clean set of clothes, and sometimes they were also given a Bible. Occasionally, children brought small items from their birth families, but usually they were not allowed to keep them. And this policy was meant to encourage children to create a fresh start and a totally new life with their new families. But many of the children, understandably, did not understand that, did not see it that way, and they were very hurt when their only memories of their former home were taken away. After the children were dressed in their best, they were taken to a public space, usually a theater, a city hall, school, or church, and this was where prospective families could meet them. Often their arrival had been the talk of the town for weeks in advance, and people from all over the area would come to watch them find new homes. These meetings are remembered both positively and negatively by orphan train riders. If a family found a child that they wanted to foster or eventually adopt, they would need to be approved by their local committee, and then they needed to agree to the Children's Aid Society's terms and conditions. And this agreement was not always a formal legal agreement. Sometimes it was just a verbal agreement that the family would take care of the child and help them get an education. Either way, the Children's Aid Society reserved the right to remove any child at any time if they felt that they weren't being taken care of properly. Similarly, the family taking the child could request their removal at any time. The agent who accompanied the children was tasked with following up after a short amount of time to make sure the children were being taken care of. If the child and the family both seemed happy, the agent would check in once a year until they were certain the child had found a permanent home. If a child needed to be removed from a home, agents would come and retrieve them and find them a new family, but they usually kept them in the same area. Speaking of keeping people in the same area, if there were groups of siblings needing to be placed out, many of the agents tried their best to keep them in the same home, but often they ended up in the same area rather than the same home. But this ensured that they could still go to school together and kind of grow up together and not lose touch. That said, some siblings were separated, and the Children's Aid Society was pretty good at keeping them together, but many other organizations did not have that same success. Many agents became very attached to the children that they placed, and all of the images you see on your screen right now, and some of the ones from the last couple slides, came to us as part of a donation of Agent Anna Laura Hill's personal collection. Agent Anna Laura Hill photographed many of the children she helped place, and she placed hundreds of children across the United States, and she stayed in touch with many of them for the rest of her life. Most of the children placed by the Children's Aid Society luckily did find pretty good homes. In the early days of the movement, there was less checking in and more opportunities for children to be placed in bad situations, but by the end, they had really figured out a pretty decent system. The Children's Aid Society themselves estimated that over 80% of the children they placed were placed successfully. We estimate that's probably between 75 and 80% in actuality. After the success of the Children's Aid Society's first few trips, other orphanages and institutions started placing out their own wards by Orphan Train, following the pattern created by Brace. This list that you see now is just a few of the organizations that we know place children out by Orphan Train. The two largest placing agencies after the Children's Aid Society were the New York Foundling Hospital and the New York Juvenile Asylum. The juvenile asylum got started about the same time as the Children's Aid Society, and they followed a very similar system. But they primarily focused on older children. The New York Foundling Hospital, on the other hand, was very different than pretty much any other organization working with orphan trains at this time. The Foundling Hospital was run by Catholic sisters, Catholic nuns, and they focused specifically on helping young children. One of the most iconic elements of the Foundling Hospital was their cradle that they kept in their front room or on their doorstep. And this was a safe place for mothers to leave their babies, no questions asked. The equivalent of this today would be safe haven baby boxes that are found at many fire stations, police stations, and also hospitals are a safe place to leave children. These children that were left at the Foundling would be taken care of until they were old enough to be transferred to another institution, fostered out in New York State, or placed with Catholic families across the country. The Foundling also had a little bit of a different system for finding these children homes and for getting them to those homes. The Foundling, instead of using a local committee to approve families, utilized the already existing system of parish leaders. So if you wanted to adopt from the Foundling, you needed to have your local priest's seal of approval. You could also request children from the Foundling. In fact, you were supposed to write in and apply by mail. And you could make requests on your application for certain characteristics like brown hair, blue eyes, and also for the age and gender of the child. It seems kind of funny to think of this now, but it was almost like a mail order child. And the Foundling Hospital did actually make multiple stops on their orphan trains instead of just one stop where all the children were distributed. They pre-assigned children to families, and so they would write you a letter back telling you, congratulations, we have a child for you. And they would say, meet us at this train station in your area on this day at this time, and your child will be wearing number 25. They utilized a number system during their travels because so many of the children were young enough that it was hard to find them all by name. Many of them weren't talking, weren't walking, and they also traveled in very large groups. And so the number system just made things so much easier. And like I said, they did make multiple stops, traveling all the way across the country and meeting Catholic families along the way who had applied and received a child. So one of the most common questions I get is, what were the nationalities of these children? And while it is impossible or nearly impossible to accurately know the nationalities of every child placed on an orphan train, we do have some data that can kind of give us an idea of where most of the orphan train riders were probably born. So the Children's Aid Society's annual reports between 1854 and 1896 recorded the nationality of each child they found a home for. This table shows the top 16 nationalities recorded during that time. And as you can see, the largest category is American-born. We estimate that probably 50% of the children placed on orphan trains were American-born. And the fact that most of the other children placed on trains were white reflects many of the ideas of the time and some of the leaders' personal prejudices. For example, Charles Loring Brace believed that American and Western European cultures were superior, and that children from those backgrounds were more acceptable to the communities where children were placed. And this, unfortunately, was a common sentiment among many other organizations. But that being said, most of them did sometimes take in or place out children of color. People of color in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were generally considered less intelligent and less capable than white people. And these beliefs were reinforced by pseudoscience and biased research. Many people thought that people of color were only good for cheap labor. And I think it's that reason that a lot of these organizations did not place out children of color very often, because they knew it would be hard to find good homes for them where they would be treated well. And unfortunately, probably because they didn't have a very high opinion of these children either, which is just heartbreaking. That being said, many orphanages did care for children of color, and some were specifically built for those communities. Most of these were schools that taught trades that were open to people of color, such as cooking, firefighting, and shoemaking. And actually, many of the children attending these schools and orphanage schools were not actually orphans at all, but they came to get an education because at the time, schools were not open to children of color, public schools. The Children's Aid Society operated at least 5 schools that were primarily serving communities of color, but their staff was almost entirely white. On the other hand, we have the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum and the Guardian Angels Home. Both of these orphanages operated schools, and both of them were entirely staffed by Black people. They had Black teachers, caretakers, and board members. The Howard Colored Orphan Asylum was rebuilt in 1868, and that served as a home for children of formerly enslaved people who were fleeing the South. The Guardian Angels Home served a similar group of people, but they also had a partner orphanage in Leavenworth, Kansas, and they sometimes sent children from New York to their partner orphanage in Kansas and then found them homes from there. We do know that children of color did ride the orphan train, but they were pretty rare and they are very, very hard to trace through the historical record. Now let's shift our focus to a local example and really make this history real and personal. So Johnson County received 2 orphan trains that we know of at this point. They probably received more, but we don't know every single orphan train that happened. We don't know where every single train went. We don't know the names of every child that rode the trains. We don't even know the exact number of trains or number of children. But these 2 we do know came to Johnson County. So the first orphan train came to Olathe in 1880. And the agent on this train was Agent J.P. Brace, and this was Charles Loring Brace's son. The group was made up of 11 boys, and they had their public meeting at the Congregational Church. In these earlier days of the orphan train, the agents sometimes gave sermons associated with their placing out meetings, and so it's possible that that's what happened here since the placing was at a church. Olathe received a second orphan train in 1896 in December, and the agent on board this time was Agent B.W. Tice, and he headed up hundreds of orphan train trips. This group had 13 boys and 1 girl, and their public meeting took place at the Opera House. This picture in the bottom left shows Olathe around this time, 1896-ish. Kind of an idea of what it would have looked like when these kids arrived. And then these 2 newspaper articles are examples of the kind of publicity these groups received. So the one on the left would have been published before they arrived, announcing when they were coming and how you could apply and who you should apply to. And the one on the right is reporting after the fact. The Opera House was filled to its capacity last Friday. The New York Children's Aid Society brought a good number of children here. Nearly all the people wanted girls, but Mr. Tice only brought 1, and she soon found a home. And then many of these types of newspaper articles would then list the names of the children who were on the train and the names of the people who took them in. And those kinds of articles are obviously very helpful for our work in collecting the names of orphan train riders. So 2 of these orphan train riders from this 1896 group were Arthur Bartow and Herman Pfeiffer. So Arthur Bartow was born May 4th, 1887, in Flushing, New York. He had two birth sisters, Lillian, who was older than him, and Ethel, who was younger. We're not really sure how they ended up in the Children's Aid Society. Please excuse the train in the background. And so we're not sure how they ended up in the Children's Aid Society. It's possible that their mother had died, or their family was just too poor to take care of them. Either way, we do know that their father was still alive at the time they were placed in the Children's Aid Society. So at 9 years old, he rode the orphan train to Olathe and was taken in by Dr. George Good and his wife, Virginia. Arthur grew up with the Goods' biological children, Mary, William, and Minnie. He was able later in life to reconnect with his younger sister, Ethel, a few years after he was placed on the train. Ethel was placed in Lewisburg, Kansas, and this is one of those weird examples where the siblings actually were separated. Luckily, in this case, they reconnected later. He also later reconnected with his older sister, Lillian, and in 1920, they were actually living together. Arthur makes an appearance in the Olathe Mirror newspaper in 1902. He was involved in the explosion of a toy cannon and was a little bit injured, but he was okay. He made it out. He married his wife, Teresa, in 1907, and they actually moved back to New York State. They had 6 children together, and Arthur worked in a rubber factory and also as a bartender, and he died in 1962. Herman Pfeiffer, on the right, he was born in Germany in 1881, and his family came to the United States in 1882 when he was still just a baby. He had 2 siblings who were born in New York, and we're not really sure what happened to these siblings. It's possible they were just sent to live with family, friends, or placed with different foster parents. Herman, though, was sent to Olathe and was taken in by the Fred Lowe family. We're not sure how long he stayed with the Lowes, but 4 years later, he was living with Charlie and Emily Klein in Ottawa County, where he was working as a school janitor. Herman moved to Minneapolis, Kansas at some point. He also attended the University of Kansas and became a teacher, and this picture we have of him comes from the KU yearbook. He taught school in Wetmore, Kansas, and later became a principal there, and later he taught in and was the principal at Bonner Springs, Kansas. Herman loved to learn, and even after he finished school and was working as a teacher, he kept attending classes just for fun. In 1910-ish, he moved to Washington State. He got married there to a lady named Mary, and he taught in Seattle, Washington, and then attended law school. His first wife died in the 1930s, and he later remarried twice. So now we come to the end of the orphan train. So after nearly 75 years, the orphan train movement gradually came to an end. This end was brought about by many different factors. Some of the reasons were the growing objections to the various aspects of the system, such as the fear that children were being used as servants or slaves. Other critics objected to the children themselves, stating that they were criminals, poor characters, and they were just going to take up space in Western institutions instead of Eastern West institutions. Other people took issue with the orphan train system itself, calling out the lack of consideration for religious backgrounds, faulty systems for checking up on children, and the legal uncertainty surrounding many placements. Additionally, in the late 1800s, many states started enacting official adoption laws and laws that made placing out more complicated. These laws sometimes allowed state boards of charities to inspect all organizations that brought children to their state, or mandated that children must be well-behaved and perfectly healthy. Other laws required legal paperwork that many of the agencies just weren't using. And these restrictions were not bad by any means. They just made placing out more difficult. At the same time, American values and attitudes towards institutional care, the family and home, and social programs were changing. And these shifts in institutional care were fueled in part by the professionalization of the field of sociology and social work. This led to programs inspired by scientific findings instead of religious fervor, and also led to an increase in state-sponsored aid, which also meant an increase in state oversight. Additionally, the types of aid being given were shifting back towards outdoor relief. So these would be things like food deliveries, financial support and education for mothers, tenement reform, increased daycare programs, and kindergartens. And the focus of this aid was directed at the family unit as a whole, rather than just at women or children. Large dormitory-style institutions gradually gave way to smaller foster homes, cottage housing, and specialized schools. And this happened all across the country. It was not just an East Coast phenomenon. So in the end, the orphan train movement was good and bad. It was certainly imperfect, and some children were mistreated or were just unhappy, and it is very important to hear and to tell those stories. But many children did find loving homes that had the means to give them the childhood that was hoped for them at the time. Many of these children grew up to be productive citizens and went on to have families of their own. And today there are probably about 2 million descendants of these orphan train riders who continue to serve our country and their local communities. And so before I end, I of course have to talk about the Orphan Train Complex. Today, nearly 100 years after the end of the Orphan Train, which was 1929, I get to stand here or sit here and share the incredible history of the Orphan Train movement. The National Orphan Train Complex grew out of the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, which was a group of orphan train writers and researchers that were dedicated to preserving orphan train history. And that group was founded in 1987. But they knew as they collected these artifacts and these stories that they needed a permanent home for their collection. And so they held kind of a mini contest to select a city to build that home in. Concordia, Kansas managed to beat out communities in Iowa and Nebraska. And in 2007, the National Orphan Train Complex Museum and Research Center opened to the public. We have hundreds of unique objects which belong to orphan train riders, their families, and the organizations that sent them west. And we hope that our work helps people to understand the complexities of this movement. In addition to our museum, we also have 40 statues of orphan train riders scattered across our town. And each one of these statues represents an orphan train rider and shares their life story. We also host an annual celebration of orphan train riders each June, where orphan train riders, descendants, researchers, and friends gather to hear presentations and share stories. We're also blessed to have many generous donors that help keep our doors open and help keep us improving each year. And if you're interested in visiting, having us do research on your orphan train riders, coming to our celebration, or making a donation, feel free to visit our website, which is listed here on your screen, or email me. Thank you for having me, and we're going to open up for questions now.
All right, thank you so much. We have had a few questions come in. I am going to highlight the Q&A box. So anyone who's looking for that, who wants to submit a question, can. We'll get started here with, did the orphanage that Eliza Hamilton founded send children on the orphan train?
That is a good question. I've looked into it before, and I don't believe they did, but again, there's so many organizations that did this kind of similar system that it's possible they did, but at this point we haven't found evidence that that orphanage was sending kids on orphan trains.
All right. Did orphan trains ever pick up children along the way?
Not Well, I was going to say not that we know of, but we do know of one instance of that. The very first orphan train, they picked up a kid in Albany because the boys got off the train in Albany and they made a friend on the docks. And they were like, hey, this guy doesn't have a home. Can he come with us? And the agents were like, sure, why not? But as far as we know, that's really the only time that happened.
Oh, that's great. Do you have any idea how many children return to New York as adults?
I don't have any idea. We only have really good information on about 3% of all orphan train riders at this point. Obviously, we're trying to grow that number. And so we don't really have enough information to start gathering statistics like that, but that is certainly something that would be really fascinating to study in the future.
Do you know how many children were sent to Kansas?
We know at least 4,000 children were sent to Kansas by the Children's Aid Society alone. I would estimate that with the Foundling Hospital involved as well, you could probably double that number. So I would estimate maybe around 8,000 kids came to Kansas, give or take maybe 1,000.
All right. Did any other countries do something similar to the orphan trains?
Yes. So the main one that we know of is Canada. Canada had a very similar system to the orphan trains, but it was a little bit bigger in terms of distance covered. Many of the kids left from London and would go on a boat to Canada, and then when they reached Canada, then they'd be put on trains and sent to farming communities across Canada. And these are typically called British home children, is what the descendants call the group. And there are a couple Facebook groups dedicated to their researchers, their descendants today. And as far as I know of, that's really the only one that I know of and I have looked into. I don't think many other countries did something quite like this.
Okay. Were the names of children ever changed by their new families?
Great question. Yes, all the time. So children who were adopted or fostered at a very young age were very likely to take new names or be given new names by their new families. Some of them kept their first names but changed their last names. Some of them changed their entire name. Some kept their original names as middle names. And then older children were less likely to change their names, and older boys especially were very unlikely to change their names. Additionally, if the children were not legally adopted, which many of the children weren't, sometimes they would go by their foster family's name for the first, couple years of their life, and then when they moved out, then they would go back to using their original name. There's a whole variation of of outcomes here, and that makes researching orphan train riders pretty tricky because sometimes they have like 2 or 3 different names they're going by at different points in their lives.
All right, this one is kind of a specific advice question. So at the end of this, if you want to let them know specifically how to contact you if they have other questions similar to this person has an ancestor that was placed in an orphanage in North Texas, and they're trying to identify how she got there from South Texas. Do you have any advice on how to go about that?
Gotcha. That is an interesting question. My guess, my place to start would be start with the local historical societies in those areas. So if you know where she was born, I would reach out to that local historical society and see if they had, an orphanage or somebody who took in orphaned or needy children, and kind of if they know their story. I would also look into the area where she ended up in North Texas and research that, contact that local historical society, see if you can get information on that orphanage. They may hopefully have records from those orphanages, and that would be like the ultimate jackpot of information there if they did. But regardless, they probably would have information on the orphanage, and that might give you some more clues to go on there.
And this is kind of another one along that same vein. Is there any way to find out what agency an orphan came from?
Yes. So a lot of the orphan train riders that we researched came from New York City. And those are usually the easiest to research because many of those organizations still exist today. So the Children's Aid Society still exists, the New York Foundling Hospital still exists, and the juvenile asylum still exists in some form, but their historical records are very accessible. And so each of those three major organizations and those three major groups sent out most orphan train riders. Those three groups still exist. And so if you know what religion your orphan train rider was, Protestant or Catholic, then we can point you in the direction to one of those organizations and you can reach out and see if they have information. New York State privacy laws, especially around adoption, are pretty restrictive. So you do kind of need to know, the name of the person you're looking for, approximately when they were born or sent on the train. And then for the foundling at least, you'll have to pretty extensively prove that you're related. The Children's Aid Society and Juvenile Asylum are much easier to work with. And yeah, you can usually, between those three, we can usually, if they came from New York, usually figure out where they came from.
Are there any orphan train children still surviving that you have contact with?
We don't have any contact with any living orphan train riders at this point. The last one that we were in contact with died in 2021, last year or 2 years ago. And we're not aware of any more. There probably are a small handful, but they would have been adopted probably pretty young. And they may or may not know that they were part of this movement. They would probably be from the Foundling Hospital, maybe from the Children's Aid Society, but they would be quite elderly, and there's probably not very many of them left. Today, we're mostly working with their children, their grandchildren, and now their great-grandchildren.
All right. What made you want to study this topic? Was there a family member who was on the orphan train?
So far, I have not found any of my own family members who rode the orphan train. I think they all went straight to Utah and didn't have time to be sent on the orphan train. But I was interested in the topic because I've always been interested in the time period. So the late 1800s and early 1900s are this incredible time of modernization, industrialization. And I have a degree in art history, but I was very interested in the way that social history interacted and informed the art of the time. So the art's very interesting and weird because there's so many changes happening in society at the time. And so that's how I got interested in this time period and applied for this job. I actually didn't really know hardly anything about the orphan train when I started working here. So I had a very steep learning curve, and I read a lot of books in my first couple of weeks. And it is a completely fascinating history. And now there's so much more. I had so many more questions. I have to study. I have to know.
Exactly. We had a unit in 4th grade that covered the orphan train. I'm not sure why. It has to be like somebody had a connection, I'm sure, somewhere.
Yeah.
But
we do find that a lot of
idea.
teachers in that 4th, 5th grade, that's kind of where the orphan train starts to get taught. I didn't learn about it in school at all. I only knew about it from a couple podcasts.
Yeah, most people have no idea. That's why we're hosting it on this program.
Absolutely.
In the East Coast orphanages of this era, what's the oldest children that would remain in care? Was 18 the age of majority back then, or was it younger?
So most of the formal agreements that foster parents or families had, they usually stipulated that they care for girls until age 18 and boys until age 21. And I think that's because the expectation was that girls would probably get married around the age of 18 and move out, and their husband would provide for them. Boys might take a little longer, start, to work on a farm or something, kind of get some job training, and then move out. In terms of how long children would be allowed to stay at orphanages, that's a little bit more variable. Older children often just got tired of living at them and left. But we do know that children up to and even past 18, so some adults actually rode the orphan train with groups of younger kids. And these adults usually were riding west, not to find foster homes, but more to find work. The Children's Aid Society sometimes sent families west. They would send, mom, dad, and a couple kids. They would all go west with a group of kids and stop, off at a different stop and start their new life there. Lately, we've found a couple examples of older teenage girls going to find jobs with these groups of children as well.
Interesting. This goes back to your story of Johnson County orphans. Were girls usually preferred? And if so, why was that?
So at the beginning of the Orphan Train Movement, they mostly sent boys out because kind of the initial idea was that these farm families could use an extra hand, and boys should go and they should learn farming skills and they can help settle the West. A little more of a working type relationship than a family type relationship. But they very quickly learned that people wanted children for their family and not just for their farm. And so that's when we start to see kids getting younger and when we start to see more girls being sent. So by the 1890s, it's a little more even on some trips, more girls starting to pop up. By 1900 and after that, it's really more 50-50 for gender parity there, closer to gender parity there. And girls, honestly, I think they were a little more preferred, and I'm not sure why. I wonder if people kind of had an idea that girls would be better behaved, easier to take care of, and maybe they thought they were cuter. We know, of course, that none of those things are necessarily true for girls versus boys, but that perception was probably there.
Do you know if any of the orphans ever reconnected with their birth families at a later age?
Absolutely. We definitely know of orphan train riders reconnecting with their birth parents. Some riders, of course, did not have birth parents still living to reconnect with, but many did. And there's kind of mixed experiences with that. Some of the kids reconnected with their parents and realized, maybe it's not so bad I was sent on the orphan train. My life was pretty good, and I like the people who raised me better than this stranger, really. And some children actually ended up going back to New York, reconnecting with their birth parents, and even living with them again. That was pretty rare, but it definitely did happen.
All right. And our last question, do you have a favorite writer story?
There's so many good ones. I'll tell you what I think is what is the most interesting story, though, because I saw this on another question or comment, and I think it's good to bring up. So I think one of the most interesting stories was a group that the New York Foundling Hospital took to Arizona in 1903 or 04. And they took a group of children to an area of Arizona that was primarily a Mexican mining community, but there was also a white population in this mining community. And when they got there, they realized that the Catholic priest who'd orchestrated the group, most of his parishioners were Mexican families. And so many of these white Irish children were being placed with Mexican families. And the sisters didn't necessarily have a problem with that, but the other white families in the area had a big problem with that. And so they actually ended up kidnapping some of the children before they made it to their foster homes. one of the little girls actually was already sick, and because she was exposed to like during this giant rainstorm and this whole kidnapping incident and slept in a barn, she actually ended up dying from that sickness that she had, which is a sad outcome there. But it was this whole crazy experience, and the court case that came out of it actually went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And they ultimately ruled that the children who had been kidnapped by the white families should remain with the white families. And so one of those girls, she was placed with a family. I wish I had a way to pull up the picture. Her name was Anna, Anna Doherty. Doherty was the family that took her in. And she had a great childhood, but it makes you wonder what her childhood would have been like if she had been placed with the family that had originally been arranged for her. And so that's just a really interesting story. We actually have a lot of her childhood objects in our collection. We have her little brownie camera, her shoes that she wore on the trip, some other little trinkets from her. So it's just a really interesting story. And your library may have a book about it called The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction. So that's kind of the most interesting, in my mind, most interesting orphan train story, because it highlights so much about society and racism and cultural clashes and all of those different things.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. Full disclosure to those listening, I was the curator of the Orphan Train Complex from 2012 to 2014. So I will be attending Celebration this year because it's a special one, right? 20th?
It is our 20th anniversary. We were founded in 2003, so it is going to be a big deal. We're having author Andrea Warren, and her books are really fantastic. Definitely check those out from your library. I'm certain they have those. She's written 2 books about the orphan train, one called We Rode the Trains, that's kind of a collection of orphan train stories, and then her other one is called One Boy's True Story, and that is about one boy's story about the orphan train. So definitely check those out, and if you're able to come to Celebration in June and hear her speak, we would love to have you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Thank you to Johnson County Library staff who helped make this program possible. And thank you all so much for attending today. Please let us know through the poll on the screen where you heard about this program so we know where to advertise in the future. Our next The Past is Prologue program will be in person on Thursday, June 15th in the Carmack Community Room at the Central Resource Library. It'll be at 6:30. We will begin with a screening of a 30-minute documentary about Womantown, Kansas City, which was an intentional lesbian community in Midtown Kansas City in the 1990s. And that will be followed by a Q&A with the filmmaker Sandy Woodson. So thank you all so much for attending, and we'll see you at our next program.
Thank you for having me.